The first sign that something had gone wrong was not an explosion. It was silence. Ambassador Velkorati of the Thess-Sign Compact noticed it on a Tuesday, though nobody in the council chamber called it Tuesday anymore. She noticed it the way one notices a missing tooth, not by looking, but by the tongue finding the gap where something used to be. For 11 years, the human delegation had occupied the same 3 seats at the eastern curve of the amphitheater. Blue placards, a little worn at the corners, because humans insisted on physical nameplates instead of holographic ones. Some sentimental habit nobody had bothered to explain. The seats were empty. The placards were gone. Vel asked the chamber steward, a soft-spoken Thrain with skin like brushed pewter, where the human delegation had relocated to. They didn't relocate, Ambassador, the steward said. They withdrew. Formally. Filed at 0300 station time. All seats, all treaties, all personnel. Effective immediately. Vel laughed, because it seemed like the kind of thing you laughed at. Humans threatened to leave the council roughly twice a year, usually after being outvoted on something they considered a matter of principle, and everyone else considered a matter of paperwork. It was a running joke among the older delegates. The humans stomp out, sulk for a news cycle, and come back within the month with a fruit basket and a grudge. They've done this before, Vel said. They took their fleet with them this time, the steward said. All of it, including the ships stationed at the Kestra Line. Vel stopped laughing. The Kestra Line was not glamorous. It didn't have a name that sounded like it mattered. It was a scattering of buoys and a modest human garrison strung along the border of council space and the territory claimed by the Ushkur Dominion, a claim the Dominion had never stopped pressing, and the council had never quite gotten around to settling. Nobody thought about the Kestra Line. That was rather the point of it. Vel had been on the council for 31 years. She had watched 6 wars get talked down to treaties, 3 genocides get talked down to sanctions, and 1 particularly ugly trade dispute get talked down to a strongly worded letter. In every case, somewhere in the room, a human delegate had eventually leaned back in their chair, folded their arms, and said some version of the same sentence. We're not doing that. It wasn't a threat. It never sounded like a threat. It sounded almost bored. But it worked every time, because nobody in that chamber, not the Ushkur, not the Oswin Trade Assembly, not even the Compact's own military attaches, actually knew what would happen if humanity meant it. Now, they had left the building. Vel requested an emergency session. It took 4 hours to convene a quorum, because half the delegates assumed this was another human tantrum and didn't see the urgency. By the time the chamber filled, the first reports were already coming in from the Kestra Line, and they were not reports anyone wanted to read aloud. 300 light-years away, in a control room that smelled of machine oil and the particular ozone tang of overworked cooling systems, Fleet Marshal Renata Eibach stared at a screen and felt something settle in her chest like a stone dropping into still water. "Confirm that," she said. Her sensor officer, a young man named Preet who had joined the fleet 8 months ago and had never once had to say anything alarming into a comm, said it again anyway. Ushkur Dominion vessels. 41 confirmed. More incoming. They've crossed the Kestra Line, ma'am. They're not slowing down. Renata had commanded the Kestrel garrison for 6 years. She knew the buoys personally, in the way you know the furniture in a house you've lived in too long. She knew, too, that the garrison had been quietly, deliberately understrength for the last 3 months, not by accident, not by budget failure, but because Fleet Command had been drawing ships back toward Earth in a slow, unannounced trickle since the vote. She had asked her superiors about it. The answer she'd gotten back had been 3 words long. Orders are orders. She looked at the tactical display now and understood, with the sick clarity of someone watching a plan complete itself, that the trickle hadn't been budget failure at all. She thought about the message that had come through 11 days before, buried in a routine command update, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. A single line noting that Fleet Command had reclassified the Kestrel garrison from border defense to advisory presence, effective on the date of the council vote. Nobody had explained what that meant. Nobody had asked her to sign anything, approve anything, or brief her officers on anything. It had simply appeared, the kind of bureaucratic language that meant everything and nothing until the day it meant everything. "Ma'am," Preet said, "orders?" Renata had 11 ships. The Dominion had 41 and rising. She had spent 6 years of her life believing that the reason the Ushkur never crossed this line, not once in 6 years, despite probing it constantly, despite testing every centimeter of it with drones and navigational errors and diplomatic brinkmanship, was that they didn't know what humanity would do if they did. Now she understood that the Ushkur had simply been waiting to find out what humanity would do if they weren't there at all. "Pull back," she said. "Full evacuation of the forward stations. We are not fighting this. Ma'am, there are civilian settlements on." "I know where the settlements are, Lieutenant." Her voice didn't rise. It went quieter instead, which was worse. "We are 11 ships against 41 and climbing. We are not fighting a war we were told an hour ago we're not part of. Get every evacuation shuttle in this sector into the air. Now." The bridge moved around her in the controlled scramble of people who had drilled for this exact scenario 100 times and never believed they'd run it for real. Preet relayed the order. Somewhere below decks, klaxon started, and Renata made herself stand still while the ship shuddered with the weight of its own evacuation protocol coming alive. She thought, unbidden, of the fruit basket joke, the one the other delegates told about humanity storming out of the council and coming back a month later with an apology and a peace offering. She wondered whether anyone back on the station understood yet that this time there wasn't going to be a fruit basket, that the 11 ships pulling back from the Kestra line weren't retreating from a fight. They were retreating from a war that had never technically been theirs to fight in the first place, not anymore, not since a vote 3 weeks ago had decided, on paper, that humanity's judgment about when and where to use force was something the rest of the council got to overrule. Fine, she thought, watching the last shuttle clear the outer marker. Then it's the council's border now. Let's see how they hold it. She did not enjoy the thought. It arrived anyway, and she let it sit there, unspoken, while the garrison folded itself backward into the dark. The emergency session on the council station lasted 19 hours. Vel sat through all of it. The Ushkur ambassador, a broad, unhurried man named Daskavir Wren, who had spent a decade being the most patient, reasonable voice in the chamber, did not attend. His seat, too, sat empty, though nobody remarked on it until the second hour, when someone finally checked and discovered his shuttle had departed the station 4 days earlier. 4 days. Before the human withdrawal was even filed. That detail sat in the room like a held breath. "They knew," said the Oswin trade delegate, a wiry, anxious being named Talfin, who had made a career out of not being the one who said the quiet thing out loud, but said it now anyway. "The Ushkur knew this was coming. Before we did." "That is speculation," said someone from the back of the chamber, a junior attaché whose species Vel couldn't place from that distance. "It is not speculation," Talfin snapped. "It is a shuttle departure log." Vel said nothing. She was doing arithmetic in her head, the kind that made her stomach hollow out. 6 settled systems along the Kestrel corridor. 200,000 civilians, give or take, mostly Oswin and Thess-Sign colonists who'd built lives out there specifically because the region had been, for 6 years, the quietest stretch of border space in the quadrant. Quiet because of 11 human ships nobody had thought much about. The council had spent 3 decades complaining about humanity, about their blunt diplomacy, their refusal to explain themselves, their habit of unilaterally deciding what they would and wouldn't tolerate and then simply not tolerating it, with or without a vote. Half this chamber had spent careers building alliances specifically designed to outvote and outmaneuver the human delegation, to remind them they were one species among hundreds and did not get to act like the exception. They had finally succeeded, 3 weeks ago, in a vote to formally reprimand humanity for unilateral military posturing after a human strike group had, without council authorization, intercepted and disabled 3 Ushkur warships caught running weapons through a supposedly neutral corridor. The vote had passed 118 to 34. It had felt, at the time, like a victory for procedure over impulse. Like proof the council could hold even its most powerful member accountable. Vel had voted for it. She thought about that now, watching the tactical feeds from the Kestra line scroll past on the chamber's main display, and felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not quite regret. Regret implied you'd know better next time, and she was no longer sure there'd be a next time that mattered. "We need to authorize a joint council response fleet," said the presiding chair, a Vantic elder whose voice carried the particular gravity of someone who had chaired 100 sessions and never once had to chair one like this. "We put forward the motion for a vote." "On what timeline?" Vel asked. "Standard procedure. 72 hours for delegate consultation. Then, there will be no Kestrel corridor in 72 hours, Vel said. It came out flatter than she intended, but she let it stand. The chamber, for the first time in 19 hours, went quiet in a way that wasn't procedural. Somewhere in the middle tiers, a delegate Vel didn't recognize. Young, from one of the smaller member worlds that rarely spoke in general session, raised a hand and asked the question nobody senior enough to matter had been willing to ask. "What if this isn't a message?" the delegate said. "What if they're simply gone, and this is what gone looks like?" The presiding chair opened his mouth to answer, then didn't. Nobody did for almost a full minute, and the silence told Vel more than any speech could have. 30 years of assuming humanity's departures were performances, theater with a return date built in, and not one delegate in that chamber, in that moment, could say with any confidence that this one was. On Earth, for days after the withdrawal, a message arrived at a modest office building in what had once been called Geneva, addressed not to the government, not to the military, but to a single retired diplomat named Eric Solane, who had represented humanity at the Council for 11 years before stepping down 8 months earlier under circumstances the press had described, inaccurately, as health reasons. He read it twice before he understood it was a genuine request, and not a mistake in the routing. "The Council formally requests your presence, as an independent observer, to discuss the situation at the Kestrel Corridor." Not a diplomat, an observer. They weren't asking humanity to come back. They were asking one man, stripped of any authority to bind his own government to anything, to come and explain what was happening. Because in 11 years of representing a species nobody fully trusted and nobody fully understood, Eric Solane had become, without particularly meaning to, the only person in known space who could translate humanity's silences into something the rest of the galaxy could parse. He sat with the message for a long time before he answered it. He thought about the vote. He'd watched it from home, retired, uninvolved, and had felt something curdle in him as the tally came in, 118 to 34, a number that had nothing to do with right or wrong and everything to do with how satisfying it apparently felt, after decades of tiptoeing around the one species nobody could predict, to finally put them in their place on the record. He thought about the calls he'd made in his last month in office, quietly, to counterparts he trusted, warning them that the mood back home had shifted in a way that wasn't loud but was final. Not anger. Something colder. A collective decision, made almost without discussion because it didn't need discussion, that a body, which required their fleets, their mediation, and their bluntness, but refused them an equal seat, refused to weight their vote to reflect the actual military and logistical burden they carried, and now formally reprimanded them for doing the job nobody else would do, was a body they no longer owed their protection. Nobody had believed him. He hadn't fully believed it himself, if he was honest. It had felt, even to him, like the kind of thing a species says and doesn't mean. He typed a reply. 3 words, which felt appropriate, given the source. Asterisk, "I'll come." Alone, asterisk. Before he left, he did one more thing, mostly for himself. He pulled up the public broadcasts from the days after the withdrawal, not the government statements, which had been characteristically sparse, but the ordinary noise of people talking to each other, the kind no policy analyst usually bothered reading. He had expected anger, vindication, maybe the grim satisfaction of a species that had finally stopped being polite about something it had resented for years. What he found instead was quieter than that. Neighborhoods that had spent a week glued to news feeds about the Kestrel line, worried not about vindication, but about the 11,000 strangers on Varen's Rest, and the 6 years of families along a border most people couldn't have pointed to on a star chart before that week. Veterans of the Kestrel garrison giving interviews that weren't triumphant, just tired, describing evacuation runs and long silences on the comm and the particular loneliness of holding a line nobody back home had explained they were still expected to hold. A public that had not celebrated leaving the council so much as endured the cost of it, and only afterward begun to ask, in the flat, unglamorous language people use when they are done being reasonable, why it had taken this to be heard. It wasn't triumph. Eric filed that observation away because he suspected it would matter more than anything he said in the chamber, and boarded his transport the next morning. The Ushkur advance stalled on the 9th day, not because anyone stopped them, but because they ran out of things worth taking that didn't require holding territory they now had to defend. Territory that bordered, uncomfortably, on systems where humans still lived, under old colonial treaties nobody had bothered to cancel. That was the detail that changed everything, and almost nobody outside a few tactical planning rooms understood it until much later. Humanity hadn't left the Kestrel line undefended because they'd abandoned it. They'd left it then because Fleet Command had already begun quietly consolidating around a handful of treaty worlds further in, worlds where human civilians, under century-old settlement agreements, still had every legal right to live, worlds the Ushkur Dominion, in its opening rush of ambition, had not accounted for. On the 9th day, an Ushkur scout wing, pushing deeper than the main advance, dropped out of transit above a colony called Varen's Rest and found itself looking at 8 human warships already in orbit, weapons hot, holding position around a civilian settlement of 11,000 people who had never once, in 80 years, needed protecting. The scout wing did not attack. It sat there for 6 hours, transmitting nothing, while its commanders back on the flagship tried to work out what they were looking at, a garrison or a trap or a species that had simply decided, without announcement, where its line actually was, and had drawn it around its own people rather than around a border on a council map nobody had asked them to defend in the first place. They chose not to test it. That single unrecorded decision, a scout wing commander's private calculation that the cost of finding out was higher than the value of the answer, did more to stop the Ushkur advance than the entire council's 19-hour session had managed. Aboard the Ushkur flagship, Prime Marshal Odesk Var had planned this campaign for 4 years, ever since the intelligence assessments first suggested humanity's patience with the council was thinning. He had built the entire operation around a single assumption, tested carefully over a decade of small provocations, that humanity's restraint was tied to their seat, their treaties, their standing as a council member bound by council rules. Take the seat away, or let humanity walk away from it themselves, and the restraint would go with it. A species without a chair at the table, he had reasoned, was a species without a reason to defend the table. Varen's Rest broke that assumption in 6 silent hours. Odesk stared at the same sensor feed his scout commander had transmitted back, the same 8 ships holding position over a colony that had nothing to do with any border, any treaty, any council resolution, a colony humans defended simply because humans live there, and understood with the particular clarity that comes too late to be useful, that he had built 4 years of strategy on a mistranslation. Humanity's restraint had never been about the council at all. It had been about where they drew the line around their own, and the council chair had simply been sitting inside that line, unnoticed, for 3 decades. He gave the order to consolidate, not advance. It was the closest thing to a retreat his pride would allow him to call it, and privately, in the log entry he never submitted for review, he called it the correct decision and the worst mistake of his career in the same sentence. Eric Solane arrived at the council station 11 days after the withdrawal, in a small civilian transport with no military escort, no delegation, and no authority whatsoever. He was seated, at his own request, not at the empty human seats. He refused those, pointedly, in front of the whole chamber, but in the observer gallery, among the journalists and the aides. The presiding chair asked him, in front of the assembled council, whether humanity intended to return. "I don't represent humanity," Eric said. "I represent nobody. You asked for an observer, and here I am, observing. If you want to know what humanity intends, you'll have to ask humanity, and I'd suggest doing it properly this time, with a seat that means something, not a chair you can outvote whenever it's inconvenient." "That's not an answer," said Doskavir Wren, who had reappeared in the chamber that morning, visibly less composed than his reputation, having spent 11 days watching his own government's gamble curdle into a standoff nobody had planned for. "It's the only one I have," Eric said, "but I'll tell you what I've learned, in case it's useful." You spent 30 years asking humanity to be more reasonable, more predictable, more willing to explain itself and wait its turn. And this month, you got exactly that. They stopped explaining. They stopped waiting. They simply decided what they would defend and defended it, and said nothing else at all. He let that sit for a moment. You've spent this whole session asking what humanity is going to do next, he said. I'd think about a different question. What made you so certain, for 30 years, that you didn't need to ask? Nobody answered him. Vel, watching from her seat at the eastern curve, the human placard still gone, the space beside her still empty, found she didn't have an answer either, and suspected that was rather the point. The Kestrel corridor never fully returned to what it had been. The Ushkur withdrew from the systems they couldn't hold, quietly, over the following months. Under a ceasefire nobody had negotiated so much as discovered it already happened, forged in a dozen small, unrecorded moments like the one above Varen's rest, moments where someone had to decide, alone, without instructions, how much they were willing to risk finding out. The Council, 6 months later, voted 151-9, a margin nobody could remember happening on anything, to open formal negotiations on restructuring humanity's seat. Not a reprimand, not a reward, an acknowledgement, grudging and overdue, that a body which depends on a member to do the work nobody else will do cannot also treat that member as replaceable, and that the difference between a rule that holds because everyone respects it and a rule that holds because everyone is afraid to test it is not, in the end, much of a difference at all, until the day someone tests it. Vel Karadi kept a small, useless memento from that year in a drawer in her office, a photograph of the eastern curve of the chamber, taken the day the human placards went missing. She never explained to visitors what it meant. She wasn't entirely sure herself, except that it seemed important to remember what an empty chair had once cost, and how close the whole fragile architecture of the council had come to finding out, not because humanity had threatened anything, but because, for 11 days, nobody could be certain they wouldn't. Humanity did not come back changed by anger or by triumph. They came back, when they finally did, quieter than before, the way people are quiet after they've learned exactly what they're capable of and found they didn't enjoy the answer. Renata Eibach retired from the Kestrel garrison 18 months later and was asked, at a small ceremony nobody important attended, what she wanted people to remember about the 11 days the border had gone quiet. She thought about it for longer than the question seemed to warrant. That it was never a bluff, she said finally. Everyone kept calling it one, for 30 years. It wasn't. It just took the one time nobody was watching to prove it. And the rest of the galaxy, for a long time afterward, was very careful about what it asked humanity to prove.